check out our exclusive documentary on the rise and fall of ISIS, along with several other Armchair Historian exclusives, over on our website, armchairhistory.tv. Thanks for your support. After 8 years of war in Iran, Iraq became the leading regional power in the Middle East. Iraq's fight against Iran's revolutionary Shia ideology and its staunch opposition to Israel made its dictator, Saddam Hussein, immensely popular throughout the Sunni Arab world. By 1990, the Iraqi army had ballooned into the 4th largest military in the world, with plenty of combat-hardened soldiers filling its ranks. However, the Iran-Iraq War proved to be a double-edged sword. It cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and left Iraq with mountains of debt. Much of that debt was owed to the small emirate to its south, Kuwait. While geographically small, Kuwait was incredibly wealthy and had been an important financial ally to Iraq during the war. In less than 2 years, however, this alliance morphed into hostility. Saddam believed that the other Arab states owed Iraq for taking on the common cause against Iran, and demanded debt forgiveness. The list of grievances to Kuwait in particular increased. Iraq accused Kuwait of illegally tapping its oil reserves, overproducing its OPEC quota, and even conspiring with Israel and the West to keep oil prices low and bankrupt Arab nations. Additionally, Iraq denied the legitimacy of the Kuwaiti state. The area had historically been part of the Ottoman Basra province, which in Saddam's eyes legally made the region rightfully part of Iraq following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. America's involvement in the Middle East increased dramatically during the Cold War, laying the groundwork for the conflicts it later faced in the region, including the rise of ISIS. Making objective documentaries like this one, or our AHTV exclusive on ISIS, is challenging for creators committed to presenting the facts without bias. Thankfully, I can tackle these complex topics with clarity, thanks to today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is an app and website that consolidates articles from across the globe in one place, offering insights into each source's political leanings, factual reliability, and ownership. It helps you understand who's funding a conversation, compare the coverage of the same story, and form your own conclusions based on the facts. Take the story about the fall of the Assad government in Syria, for example, and compare this left-leaning headline with this right-leaning source. Notice how the event is being spun by both sides. With Ground News, I can compare the bias distribution for every article on this story from a variety of sources around the world. The Blind Spot feed is dedicated to showing you stories disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum, letting you absorb the news on a deeper level, challenging your assumptions and beliefs on important issues, and be better equipped to engage in constructive dialogue for those who hold different views. Right now, Ground News is offering 40% off with unlimited access to my viewers, so scan the QR code or click the link in the description to sign up for a Vantage plan and get access to all of the world's news with context, and cut through the misinformation, selective coverage, and media spin. Iraq's ambitions directly clashed with American interests. Since the Second World War, the United States committed to defending Saudi Arabia, especially due to its massive oil reserves. Franklin D. Roosevelt himself had stated that the defense of Saudi Arabia is vital to the United States. Throughout the 1980s, American support became even stronger. The US was determined to guarantee the territorial integrity and the internal stability of Saudi Arabia. As it turned out, Saddam's invasion of Kuwait proved ample reason for the United States to act on its guarantee. The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait was swift and surprising. Within a single day, Saddam's army overran their underprepared and under-equipped adversaries. Starting out at 2 a.m. on August 2nd, the elite Iraqi Republican Guard swept through the emirate. Just 4 hours later, they besieged Dasman Palace, the residence of Emir Jabir al-Ahmad al-Sabah, who fled to Saudi Arabia. Scattered pockets of resistance continued for 2 days. Although Iraq secured Kuwait quickly, most Kuwaiti officials, the vast majority of the Air Force, and a few army brigades escaped into Saudi Arabia. The world quickly voiced its overwhelming disapproval of the invasion. One of the strongest reactions came from the US President George H.W. Bush. His disapproval was influenced by British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who was one of the first people Bush spoke to after the invasion. She compared the invasion to appeasement in the 1930s, saying that Saddam would have the whole Gulf at his mercy and 65% of the world's oil with it if his aggression were not quickly checked. A more panicked reaction emerged in Saudi Arabia, who feared that they were next on Saddam's chopping block. King Fahd quickly reached out to the United States to organize a thorough defense of the country and keep Saddam from invading Saudi Arabia. Throughout the world, nations flocked to condemn Saddam's invasion and annexation of Kuwait. All 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council implemented sanctions and placed arms embargoes on Iraq. The UN initially tried to get Saddam to withdraw from Kuwait through economic pressure. However, as it became increasingly clear that Saddam remained defiant, the Security Council passed Resolution 678. This legally authorized UN member states to use all necessary means to force Iraq to withdraw if it hadn't left by January 15, 1991. As the world pressured Iraq, Saddam unleashed brutal measures on the Kuwaiti population. Civilians were terrorized by arrests, torture, kidnapping, rape, and murder. People who were suspected of members of the Kuwaiti resistance were brutally tortured and publicly executed. The Iraqis looted Kuwait for all it was worth. According to an official in the Kuwaiti Reconstruction Program, the Iraqis stole everything that could be loaded onto a 5-ton truck and carried it away. Automobiles, typewriters, telephones, domestic appliances, furniture, and every other possible sort of moving possession. To protect Saudi Arabia and prepare for the liberation of Kuwait, the United States launched Operation Desert Shield on August 7, 1990. The goals were to defend Saudi Arabia while simultaneously building a massive concentration of aircraft, armored vehicles, and naval presence for the expected military campaign in Kuwait. The operation was a major logistical challenge. The buildup concentrated in the desolate, sweltering northeast of Saudi Arabia. Although the modern infrastructure in the region eased the challenge, inefficient numbers of available ships, aircraft, and trucks made transporting the heavy equipment very difficult. The list of nations committing to fight Saddam rapidly grew throughout 1990. Regional rivals like Syria and Egypt eagerly supported the coalition. Additionally, US Secretary of State James Baker convinced dozens of other nations to join and check Iraq's aggression. However, the large coalition was troubled by intricate command structures and cultural rivalries. France, in particular, sought strategic autonomy and only wanted to allow French troops to use French air bases. Arab troops preferred to only strike Iraqi targets in Kuwait, since those could be justified as an attack on Iraqi aggression, rather than an attack on Muslim civilians. Despite these differences, the coalition was able to balance operational flexibility and autonomy with a unified strategy. By January 15, 1991, the coalition consisted of 42 countries and about 900,000 soldiers under the commands of US General Norman Schwarzkopf and Saudi General Khalid bin Sultan. Facing them were over 1 million Iraqi soldiers, including the fearsome and powerful Republican Guard. These elite units were the cream of the crop in the Iraqi military, the most loyal, most disciplined, best trained, and best equipped that Saddam had to offer. When the deadline for withdrawal passed, and Saddam showed no sign of giving in, Operation Desert Shield transformed into Operation Desert Storm. The attack started with an extensive bombing campaign, which quickly overwhelmed Iraq. Within a week, the coalition established absolute air superiority. With over 1,000 sorties per day, they leveled Iraq's infrastructure and industry. Iraq's previously feared air defenses proved to be no match. The coalition aircraft flew too fast and too high. Of the almost 3,000 aircraft the coalition sent in, it only lost just 75. Saddam responded by firing wildly inaccurate Scud missiles at the coalition armies and toward neutral Israel. He hoped that by dragging Israel into the coalition, the anti-Israel Arab coalition members would leave, causing the alliance to fall apart. Despite launching missiles for 6 weeks, Israel did not retaliate. The attacks were expected, and Bush had urged Israel not to get involved. In reaction, the United States supplied anti-missile systems to Israel and ramped up its bombing of Iraqi launching sites. During the first 2 weeks of Operation Desert Storm, the war mostly involved artillery duels and bombing sorties. The coalition made a few reconnaissance missions in Kuwait, but no large-scale land fighting had occurred. Saddam, worried over falling morale amidst the never-ending bombardments, attempted to provoke the coalition into a land battle. If he could just inflict a single decisive blow, the war would become too costly for the Americans. Thus, he took the initiative and sent his troops to occupy the Saudi border city of Khafji. Iraqi troops smashed through the eastern flank of the coalition and entered the city. King Fahd, outraged that Iraqi soldiers were on Saudi soil, ordered the immediate recapture of the city. Although the ensuing battle was vicious, the Iraqi soldiers were outmatched, especially due to overwhelming coalition air power. After just 36 hours, the Iraqis fled to the Kuwaiti border. Although the battle was a tactical win for the coalition, Iraqi leaders claimed victory to bolster their troops' flagging morale. It took 3 more weeks of back-and-forth artillery fire, maneuvering, and skirmishing before the ground invasion was ready. On February 22, 1991, Bush sent a final ultimatum to Saddam: leave Kuwait within 24 hours or face a ground invasion. Saddam rejected the ultimatum and, in revenge, ramped up the destruction of Kuwait, especially by destroying its oil wells. The explosion of over 600 oil wells served both to punish Kuwait and to raise a smokescreen against the invader. The ground campaign, codenamed Operation Desert Saber, seemed to be a daunting task. Numerous Iraqi forces were deeply entrenched in Kuwait, and Saddam kept his elite Republican Guard in reserve near the Iraq-Kuwait border. Should Kuwait be overrun, they would be able to prevent a coalition advance into Iraq proper. The expectations were that the coalition would launch its main thrust into Kuwait from the south, possibly supported by an amphibious assault. The coalition actually launched its main thrust further west, deep into the Arabian Desert. The main objective was to cut off the Iraqi forces in Kuwait, encircle the Republican Guard, and destroy it. The coalition offensive lasted only 100 hours, a little over 4 days. One of the first objectives of the ground war was the capture and establishment of a forward base, deep inside Iraqi territory. In one of the deepest airborne operations in history, American forces ferried the 101st Airborne Division 100 kilometers or 62 miles behind enemy lines. Simultaneously, the first armored thrusts pierced deep into Iraqi territory. French tanks and armored vehicles advanced toward the town of Al-Salman, neutralizing a mechanized infantry division during their assault. While the coalition forces advanced in the west, American and Arab forces began breaking through the Iraqi defenses in Kuwait proper. The coalition dominated the battlefield. A well-thought-out strategy was complemented with superior technology like the M1A1 Abrams battle tank and complete air superiority. Iraqi morale was also extremely low, making the assaults very one-sided. Iraqi soldiers surrendered in droves, with many being so anxious to surrender that they gave themselves up to the first foreigners that they encountered. In one notable incident, a dozen Iraqi soldiers surrendered to an Italian news crew in broken Italian. Throughout the next 2 days, coalition forces would press further into Iraq and cut off all paths of retreat for the Iraqi armies in Kuwait. As forces in the desert drove for the Euphrates River, those in Kuwait progressively moved up the coast toward Kuwait City, assisted by naval gunfire. Although wind, rain, and smoke from burning oil fields hampered progress, coalition forces progressed steadily. The black smoke in particular led American Marines to nickname Kuwait the Land of Darkness, which helped provide a concealment to Iraqi forces attempting to counter coalition forces. Regardless of Iraqi concealment, attacks like the one near al-Barkan were quickly defeated. That same day, Saddam ordered all remaining units to withdraw from Kuwait to the Basra area. While Iraqi troops embarked on their exodus from Kuwait, the fiercest phase of the war was yet to begin. There had been a few tank-on-tank skirmishes, but only on February 26th would the tank war truly begin. More than 3,000 tanks and 1,000 more armored vehicles fought in 3 separate but closely related battles. The battles of 73 Easting and Norfolk near the Iraq-Kuwait border, and the Battle of Medina Ridge a bit further north. During the Battle of 73 Easting, U.S. General Frederick Frank's 7th Army Corps engaged the Tawakalna Division of the Republican Guard. Despite terrible weather, poor visibility, and Iraqi numerical superiority, the Americans dominated. After 6 hours of vicious battle, the United States suffered just 23 casualties. They lost a single armored fighting vehicle and didn't lose any of their tanks. Iraq suffered up to 1,000 casualties and lost 180 armored fighting vehicles and 160 tanks. The Battle of Norfolk, fought just 2 hours later and nearby, followed a similar pattern. Also referred to as Fright Night, the Battle of Norfolk was an even larger battle than 73 Easting, and fought in the dead of night. Without night vision goggles, it was impossible to see which tank was on which side during the fighting. The fighting itself was chaotic but lopsided, but after the dust settled, coalition armies were once again victorious, while close to 600 Iraqi tanks had been destroyed. The final major tank battle, Medina Ridge, marked the last stand of the Republican Guard during the war. This was arguably the quickest and most decisive victory the American Army achieved over the Republican Guard. In just a couple hours, the opposing armor divisions had been decimated, leaving the desert littered with hundreds of burning Iraqi tanks and armored personnel carriers. While these tank battles raged, one of the most infamous episodes of the Gulf War took place. American, French, British, and Canadian ground and air forces attacked the main highway between Kuwait and Iraq on the night of February 26th to February 27th, which thousands of Iraqi soldiers and civilians used in their retreat from Kuwait. When the attack was over, thousands of vehicles lay burnt or abandoned by the roadside, their occupants either dead or fled. Although the death toll is officially unknown, estimates range from hundreds to over 1,000 casualties. The carnage earned this stretch of pavement the nickname the Highway of Death. The campaign ended after only 100 hours. The few Iraqi units that remained in Kuwait to cover the Iraqi retreat were defeated during the Battle of Kuwait International Airport on February 27th. This battle marked the liberation of Kuwait City and the end of the Kuwaiti theater of the war. A ceasefire was negotiated shortly after. The United States and the United Nations had achieved their goal. Kuwait was restored, Saddam's ability to wage war was crippled, and the status quo in the Middle East was preserved. Despite its win on the battlefield, the coalition failed to achieve a strategic victory. Saddam remained in power, and the Republican Guard was not destroyed. However, the United States was unwilling to pursue the war. American officials argued that getting rid of Saddam would result in a costly and lengthy occupation, which was not worth the additional American casualties. The United States thus also did not support Shia and Kurdish uprisings against Saddam following the ceasefire. Although Bush had encouraged Iraqis to resist Saddam, he would not aid them. Within half a year, Saddam would violently crush these uprisings. Despite its short duration, the Gulf War caused extensive damage. The oil fires in Kuwait continued for 8 more months, and the Kuwaiti economy was devastated. Additionally, the oil fires and oil spills caused extensive environmental damage. While Kuwait would recover relatively quickly, Iraq was in shambles. Around 175,000 Iraqis, both civilian and military, had died. Iraq's GDP had fallen by over 64%, living standards deteriorated, and the overwhelming majority of its electric grid, industrial capacity, and infrastructure lay in ruin. In addition, UN sanctions and embargoes on the nation made it next to impossible for Iraq to rebuild. The Gulf War left Iraq an international pariah. Saddam had waged war on the world, and the world had won, albeit not decisively. Saddam was not gone, and to American policymakers, he remained a threat. The United States answered this threat by keeping Iraq on a close leash, interfering and bombing the country regularly. The troublesome relations between Saddam's Iraq and the United States would eventually set the scene for yet another, even more devastating, Second Gulf War. The dawn of September 11, 2001, signaled a monumental shift in modern geopolitics when Al-Qaeda, an extensive global extremist network, carried out a devastating attack on the United States. As a consequence, the US initiated a comprehensive effort to disassemble the organization and motivate the replacement of the supporting Taliban regime who sheltered Al-Qaeda in the war-torn region of Afghanistan. I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian, and today we will be delving into the American intervention in Afghanistan. Following the attacks on 9/11, it was immediately clear to the United States who was behind it: Osama bin Laden, founder and leading figurehead of Al-Qaeda. For President George W. Bush and his national security advisors, their immediate response was to open up channels to bin Laden's network in Afghanistan. Attempts were made by some US officials to arrange for the extradition of bin Laden without resorting to war. The most notable among these was Robert Grenier, then CIA chief in Pakistan. On September 15th, Grenier met with a Taliban commander called Akhtar Mohammad Osmani and asked for his help in turning over bin Laden to the Americans. Osmani was convinced to ask the Taliban leader, Muhammad Omar Mujahid, to surrender bin Laden in order to avoid an American invasion. However, as Grenier began opening this channel through to the Taliban, President Bush issued an ultimatum in a speech before Congress on September 20th. He called for the Taliban to surrender bin Laden and Al-Qaeda or share their fate. A bold demand, but one empowered by Congress, who had given Bush authority to use all necessary and appropriate force against those behind the September 11th attacks. This also included any supporters of the perpetrators. Mullah Omar refused Bush's ultimatum, claiming bin Laden had not committed the attacks. As further justification, Omar cited bin Laden's oath of allegiance to him and the Afghan people's honorable commitment to protect their guests. By this time, it became clear that the Taliban were no longer willing to hand over bin Laden, and Grenier's last proposals for negotiations were dismissed and his channels to Osmani dried up. In order to tackle the war against al-Qaeda and its Taliban supporters, the Bush administration developed 6 strategic objectives for the operations in Afghanistan, with the key focus being the elimination of al-Qaeda and the possible capture of Osama bin Laden. The objectives would be incorporated into the wider Operation Enduring Freedom, which was all but confirmed following the deadline left for the Taliban on October 5th. On October 7th, the United States began airstrike operations on numerous targets throughout Afghanistan, which, in turn, rallied the Taliban to Mullah Omar and bin Laden. In order to avoid the worst of these strikes, bin Laden left his home in Kandahar and disappeared, and had his top commanders sent out of the country. Al-Qaeda was virtually dismantled, except for loyal fighters who remained on the front lines outside Kabul, while others retreated east into the mountains to await the US attack. In the meantime, other divisions within the CIA were busy enacting plans parallel to Robert Grenier's overtures back in September. Under the CIA's Special Activities Division, a paramilitary team led by Senior Intelligence Officer Gary Schroen flew to Tashkent, Uzbekistan on September 20th aboard a CIA cargo plane. 6 days later, they boarded an old Russian-made Mi-17 helicopter and were inserted into the Panjshir Valley north of Kabul. They flew in with weapons, secure satellite communications gear, GPS mapping equipment, and $10 million in boxed cash. The SAD operatives were welcomed by the Northern Alliance, who were already engaged in their insurgency against the Taliban. Led by Mohammad Fahim, Schroen's agents went to work establishing the first of more than a dozen forward operating bases across Afghanistan. The SAD worked alongside Afghan warlords and rebel armies to send human intelligence back to Langley. This included important data such as the locations of minefields and terrorist safe houses. With the stroke of a computer key, counterterrorism center staff in America could keep a record of these locations and relay them to CIA paramilitary operators to assist them with field work. Operations were being driven 24/7 from inside the CIA's Global Response Center, which secured a direct line to the Defense Department's Joint Intelligence Operations Center at Central Command in Florida. The CIA's paramilitary teams would be augmented with special operations forces from the military, such as the Green Berets and Delta Force. Despite the evacuation of bin Laden and his senior officers from Afghanistan, the US military exhausted its list of fixed Taliban targets in the first 2 nights of bombing, in which more than 100 Afghans were reported killed. By October 19th, special forces had arrived with 3 12-man teams initially deployed to the areas of Takhar, Panjshir, and Mazar-e-Sharif. More arrived within the month. The Northern Alliance had 15,000 to 20,000 men, split between 4 commanders across 5 different locations: the Kabul frontline, Badakhshan, Takhar, Central Afghanistan, and Herat. Throughout Afghanistan, the Taliban had around 45,000 men, plus 2,700 al-Qaeda and other foreign fighters. The Taliban fighting forces were arrayed across the north, organized as fronts consisting of fighters under various commanders. These fronts faced the Northern Alliance forces near Kabul, Badakhshan, and Mazar-e-Sharif. Once the air campaign began, other cadres from the south and east were sent to reinforce their front line in Kabul. Additionally, volunteers rushed in from Pakistan, perhaps as many as 500 per day. Under the American Central Command in Afghanistan, General Tommy Franks launched a ground offensive after October 19th, shifting air assets to support the Northern Alliance in combat. With this new close air support, the CIA and Special Forces teams were working directly alongside Northern Alliance commanders. From October 21st, they began their attack on the Taliban front lines south of Mazar-e-Sharif, eventually leading to its capture on November 12th. Much of the success with the Northern Alliance and US Special Forces lay in their maneuverability, making extensive use of horses to sweep across the difficult Afghan terrain. In a scene somewhat reminiscent of a historical epic, Chief Warrant Officer Bob Pennington recalled their great ride toward Mazar-e-Sharif. I looked back, looked south, and then I just realized it was the most unbelievable shot I've ever seen. It was 1,000 riders on horseback. It was peaceful, yet magnificent. Victories by the coalition and its allies had spread panic throughout Taliban forces in the capital of Kabul, who began leaving the city in droves. By November 13th, the Taliban's presence in Kabul had completely collapsed, with word spreading south and undermining Taliban morale everywhere. Taliban fighters outside of the city in the eastern and southern regions started laying down arms, blending into their villages, heading to Pakistan, or making for the mountains. The sovereignty of their religious state crumbled, leaving authority up to localized tribal leaders. After the fall of Kabul, the issue of establishing a new government to replace the Taliban became a pressing concern. Instead of a formal administration, warlords took control of the areas they had liberated, causing problems in governance. The UN was pleased with the Allied victory, but dismayed at the lack of progress in forming a new government. The Northern Alliance, especially, was reluctant to expand into the Pashtun regions of Jalalabad or Kandahar, which led to the United States supporting local Pashtun allies. Hamid Karzai, a skilled diplomat and tribal leader, was chosen to lead the new interim government. To help solidify this progress, the United States, Pakistan, India, Russia, and Iran worked together at the Bonn Conference to establish a political settlement and transition Afghanistan toward democracy. This resulted in the Bonn Agreement, which outlined a series of steps toward establishing democracy, including the formation of an interim administration, a Grand Assembly to choose a transitional government, and national elections. Karzai was elected leader of this new interim government, and with US Special Forces protection, moved out of southern Afghanistan, pressing on to Kandahar city even after an accidental US bombing had injured him and killed 10 members of his retinue, along with 3 Special Forces troopers assigned to him. Despite the victories throughout Afghanistan, the hunt for Osama bin Laden and other al-Qaeda leaders was still ongoing. In early December, teams working under the CIA and Task Force SWORD had infiltrated the mountainous area of Tora Bora, confirming the presence of both Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters. On December 5th, Task Force SWORD and Northern Alliance militias advanced on Tora Bora with US air support, pushing deep into the mountain bunkers and caves. Additional Afghan fighters with aged Soviet-made tanks joined the operation, as did German and British Special Forces units. Despite the heavy bombing and capture of jihadist fighters, bin Laden was not found. The operation ended in mid-December, with estimates asserting that 1,500 to 2,000 Afghan, Arab, and Chechen al-Qaeda fighters occupied Tora Bora before the attack. Of these, perhaps 2/3 evacuated across the border into Pakistan. Other Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters crossed the border elsewhere along its 1,200-mile length. But Mullah Omar, the Taliban leader, and Osama bin Laden successfully fled to Pakistan. The evacuation of jihadists from Tora Bora left only a short moment of respite. In early 2002, American intelligence picked up indications of al-Qaeda fighters concentrating in the Shah Ikat Valley in Afghanistan. The terrain of Shah Ikat was challenging, making it difficult to reach the valley by helicopters launched from Bagram. The 10th Mountain Division, commanded by the United States Central Command in Kuwait, was moved to Bagram Airfield and became the main conventional land force in the country, and was bolstered by troops of the 101st Airborne Division. This was then designated CJTF Mountain. Led by U.S. Army Major General Franklin Hagenbeck, Operation Anaconda was launched in March 2002 to deal with the al-Qaeda presence, but soon ran into unexpected difficulties. The Afghan militia, led by U.S. Special Operations Forces, were delayed by a traffic accident and then mistakenly attacked by an AC-130 gunship. U.S. infantry were also subject to effective enemy fire from well-prepared fighting positions that were difficult to locate, and air support proved more difficult to coordinate than anticipated. Lacking organic artillery, large numbers of airstrikes and sorties by attack helicopters were needed to keep the American troops alive. This unexpectedly heavy opposition caused the U.S. infantry to withdraw from its exposed positions. On March 4th, U.S. Special Operations Forces attempted to establish observation posts to overlook the enemy. In the process, a U.S. Navy SEAL was captured and killed by the enemy, 6 more U.S. troops were killed, and a helicopter was shot down during the ensuing fighting. This part of the battle became known as the Battle of Roberts Ridge, and it took 5 more days for the ground forces to achieve control over the key terrain. Many of the al-Qaeda and jihadist defenders had been killed by intense American airstrikes, yet US troops were astonished to find well-protected trenches, bunkers, and observation posts, and supplies left intact. None of these positions had been detected by drones, air reconnaissance, or satellites. According to the United States Army reports, the operation suffered from inadequate intelligence, insufficient organic fire support, and unrealistic expectations, including an over-reliance on warlord militias. A major weakness was air-land integration due to a mutual lack of understanding between the CJTF Mountain Headquarters at Bagram Air Base and the US Air Headquarters in Qatar. Despite this, the coalition did achieve victory, with al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters being forced to evacuate the valley while suffering heavy casualties. With al-Qaeda booted out of Afghanistan and the Taliban government shattered into disparate cadres, America had achieved a measure of victory. The establishment of the Afghan interim government also contributed towards the objectives laid out by the Bush administration for Afghanistan. Yet all was not over for the Taliban. They suffered a great loss, but their struggle against the West had only just begun. It is April 10th, 2003. F-16 fighters scream to life on a nearby tarmac, while C-130 cargo planes are loaded up with supplies. A handful of soldiers play cards on a makeshift table, trying to distract themselves from the anxiety in the air. They are American, British, Australian, and Polish. All are exhausted by the long approach to the capital, but they know that the fighting is not over yet. As another plane departs for Baghdad, the Australian announces "Royal Flush" and lays down his cards. The others groan. He's won. But this is no ordinary game of poker. On each card, the face of a high-ranking Iraqi official is printed. They include generals, ministers, and, on the ace of spades, the president himself, Saddam Hussein. It is useful for the soldiers to familiarize themselves with these men. Soon enough, they'll be hunting them. Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. Today, we will be covering the 2003 invasion of Iraq, sometimes referred to as the Second Gulf War, which saw hundreds of thousands of troops committed to an invasion that ended with the deposition of a dictator. While we will cover some of the political background and context of this much-discussed conflict, this video will primarily focus on the combat, maneuvers, and objectives of the momentous invasion that sparked an 8-year occupation and insurgency. But first, if you haven't had the chance to check out our video on the first Iraq War, here is a quick recap. After it ended with Iraqi forces being expelled from Kuwait, the US soldiers sought to protect Kurdish and Shiite minorities in Iraq by enforcing no-fly zones and launching airstrikes against strategic sites such as oil fields and military bases. But following Saddam Hussein's repeated refusal to cooperate with UN weapon inspectors, the United States passed the Iraqi Liberation Act, which officially solidified the goal of regime change in the country. At the time, though, this act simply consisted of providing millions of dollars to numerous opposition groups in the country, with the hope of toppling Saddam's government. But as it turned out, America's interventions in the Middle East had already sown the seeds of a new conflict. After the shocking events of 9/11, President George W. Bush stood before a wounded nation and officially declared that a new war was about to commence. A war on terror. Unlike previous conflicts, America would now use preemptive force against any governments suspected of consorting with terrorist organizations, especially Al-Qaeda, in accordance with what would be remembered as the Bush Doctrine. Within weeks, US forces had begun tearing apart Afghanistan in pursuit of Osama bin Laden. But when the infamous mastermind of the 9/11 attacks slipped away, the US turned its attention from Afghanistan to Iraq, where for the past 12 years, Saddam Hussein had increasingly been perceived as a threat to American geostrategic interests in the region. This wasn't helped by his refusal to cooperate with the United Nations. In late 2002, the United States began building a case against the Ba'athist government of Iraq and sought the support of the UN Security Council. On top of the claimed ties to Al-Qaeda, the Bush administration had a laundry list of justifications for armed intervention, including the mistreatment of civilians and the aforementioned expulsion of UN weapons inspectors. Perhaps foreseeing how controversial these accusations would be in the future, many in the UN Security Council strenuously objected to the proposed invasion, insisting that America pursue a diplomatic solution instead. But even while the council debated, CIA teams were landing in Iraq to lay the groundwork for a full-scale invasion. The US had already made up its mind. Saddam's regime was doomed. Moving quickly, members of the Special Activities Division established contact with the Kurdish Peshmergas who opposed Saddam. Then, they began identifying key elements of Iraqi leadership. This intelligence would be used to devastating effect in the opening days of the conflict, with surgical airstrikes killing many high-ranking officers. Additionally, the Special Activities Division captured a chemical weapons factory. Yet, despite Secretary of State Colin Powell's vivid descriptions of mobile weapons laboratories on the backs of trucks and train cars, the facility was the only one of its kind found during the entire Iraq War. Unsurprisingly, these preemptive strikes did not help America's case to the UN, which continued to call for de-escalation. Key NATO members, such as France and Canada, were also highly vocal in condemning America's aggression. Opposition around the world mounted, culminating with the largest recorded protest in human history when on February 15, 2003, over 6 million people in 800 cities gathered to protest the war. Nevertheless, in March of 2003, the United States and the Coalition of the Willing, which included the United Kingdom, Poland, and Australia, among others, began massing troops in the region. Unlike the war fought 12 years earlier, they would be advancing without UN approval. The invasion began slowly. The first phase consisted of numerous airstrikes and covert raids on targets within the country, with varying degrees of success. One of the first of these was the Battle of Al-Qaim on March 17th, when units of the British Special Air Service attacked a suspected chemical weapons site housed in a water treatment facility near the Syrian border. But the Iraqi defenders put up an unexpectedly spirited defense, and the commando team was forced to withdraw under heavy fire. Frustrated, they called in an airstrike leveling the entire facility and obliterating any potential evidence that chemical weapons were being held in the facility. Another strike occurred 2 days later at a community just outside Baghdad called Dura Farms. Believing that Saddam was visiting his sons in the area, the United States saturated the area with 8,000 pounds of ordnance and 40 Tomahawk cruise missiles in an attempt to wipe the Iraqi dictator off the face of the earth. However, every single satellite-guided warhead missed its target, and as a result, over a dozen civilians were injured and one killed. To complete the debacle, it was later discovered that Saddam's last visit to the area had been nearly a decade ago. Despite these issues, the main invasion was finally getting underway. Based on the precedent set in the first Gulf War and Afghanistan, most observers had expected a lengthy period of aerial bombardment before any ground offensive. However, the coalition instead opted to launch a rapid air and ground campaign that would avoid most urban areas and focus on decapitating the Iraqi government. This tactic, later called shock and awe, was chosen for two reasons. First, American leaders assumed that if the command structure was eliminated, organized resistance would disintegrate. Second, it was hoped that the civilian population would support the Americans as liberators. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld was particularly optimistic about this, stating, "There will be Iraqis who offer not only to help us, but to help liberate the country and free the Iraqi people." As we will see, this wasn't totally the case. On the night of March 19th, members of the 160th Airborne, known as the Night Stalkers, destroyed more than 70 Iraqi military outposts along the southern and western borders. With the path cleared, coalition forces advanced from Kuwait in two prongs, one directed north and one south. A combined air and amphibious assault was also launched on the Al-Faw Peninsula on March 20th. With the goal of securing the critical oil infrastructure located there. American, British, and Polish commandos all worked tirelessly to capture the offshore platforms before they could be sabotaged by the defenders. Despite significant resistance from entrenched Iraqis supported by artillery fire, the teams were able to secure the peninsula after a grueling 3-day battle. Their efforts likely prevented a major ecological disaster and saved billions of dollars worth of equipment that Saddam would otherwise have destroyed in a petty act of revenge. Unfortunately for the coalition, this would be the last bit of good PR they would receive for quite some time. As we'll see in the Part 2, which is out right now, the war for Iraq was just beginning, and even this initial taste of victory had been soured by the clumsy handling of Al-Qaim and the disaster at Dura Farms. While coalition casualties remained minimal, intelligence failures would continue to plague future operations, muddying the overall picture of the war in Iraq to such an extent that many details remain unclear to this day. The first major engagement began on March 23rd, when a maintenance convoy of the 3rd U.S. Infantry Division took a wrong turn into Nasiriyah, right into the headquarters of the Iraqi 3rd Corps. Caught in a hastily prepared ambush, 15 of the 18 vehicles were destroyed by heavy weapons fire, and 18 U.S. soldiers were killed or captured. But the strategic bridges over Nasiriyah's modestly named Saddam Canal were secured later that day after men from the 2nd Marine Division stormed the city, suffering heavy casualties from the determined Iraqi defenders. As if the intense urban combat wasn't enough, 6 Marines were also killed in a friendly fire incident when an A-10 Warthog mistakenly attacked their amphibious vehicle. Finally, on the evening of March 24th, the Marines broke through and established a perimeter north of the city, which held up despite multiple counterattacks by Iraqi forces and the Fedayeen Saddam militia, who were fanatical not only about Saddam, but apparently also about Darth Vader. Further north was the town of Najaf, which was situated close to highways leading to the important cities of Karbala and Baghdad. Due to its strategic location, coalition forces decided not to bypass Najaf, and instead chose to isolate the town out of fears it could become a staging area for attacks against American supply lines. To accomplish this, the coalition needed to capture the bridges to the north and south of the town. Elements of the 1st Brigade combat team attacked the northern bridge, codenamed Jenkins, in the early hours of March 25th, but made slow progress until they linked up with reinforcements before dawn. The Americans eventually fought their way across the bridge, despite desperate attempts by Iraqi engineers to destroy it. Around the same time, U.S. forces advanced on the southern bridge codenamed Objective Floyd. Resistance by both regular military and militia forces was intense at both sites. On one occasion, an Iraqi drove a city bus at full speed into an M3 Bradley CFV. On March 26th, Najaf was successfully encircled, and the attackers were relieved by the 101st Airborne. Over the next several days, the Americans swept through the town with tanks and infantry. The 101st deliberately left a single road out of the city open in the hope of using it as a kill zone for escaping troops. On April 1st, some weary Iraqi soldiers took the bait and were ambushed by snipers and helicopter gunships, and the city ultimately fell on April 4th. To the south, British forces had an unexpectedly difficult time taking Basra and its nearby port. Starting on March 27th, they whittled down the Iraqi garrison defending the valuable port over the course of 2 weeks. When they finally gained control of the vital waterway, only 11 Britons had died, while the Iraqis had lost some 40 to 50 times that number. When British armor finally rolled into the city, they were welcomed by jubilant locals, as predicted by US Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. Unfortunately, however, the crowds quickly turned into mobs of looters. The final major engagement before coalition forces arrived in Baghdad was at the Battle of Karbala Gap, a roughly 25-mile or 40-kilometer-long strip of land flanked by the Euphrates and Rizaza rivers. Iraqi commanders were well aware of the gap's strategic importance and had placed 2 divisions of the elite Republican Guard to block the Americans' advance. However, Saddam Hussein's son, Qusay, severely weakened the defense by redirecting some of them to the north, which proved to be a fatal mistake. On April 1st, American troops broke through the gap, reaching the Euphrates at the city of Musayyib. Though several Iraqi armored divisions counterattacked on the night of April 3rd, they were driven back by aircraft and rocket fire, and the coalition held on to the important bridgehead. With the path to Baghdad forced open and victory on the horizon, a last bloody struggle for the capital began. While the Iraqi army had almost completely disintegrated at this point, the Ba'athist Party militias holding the city did not hesitate to utilize underhanded tactics to slow the coalition advance. After extended skirmishes with the defenders, Colonel David Perkins launched a surprise thunder run of nearly 30 tanks straight into the city on April 5th. Once behind enemy lines, the column came under intense fire from militiamen disguised as civilians, but Perkins was able to identify their defensive positions and execute a fighting withdrawal. US Marines then stormed the Diyala Bridge on the eastern side of the city and advanced along the northern bank of the Euphrates. Aware that this flank was almost entirely undefended, the nervous troops fired on any car refusing to halt out of fear of suicide bombers. Amidst this carnage, Perkins led another thunder run into the heart of the capital on the 7th, and rewarded himself by spending the night in one of Saddam's opulent palaces. After a final desperate defense by the militias, the city was finally captured on April 9th. There were some initial celebrations by Iraqi civilians, including widespread vandalism of statues and portraits depicting the now-defeated Saddam. However, as in Basra, massive waves of looting soon followed and continued until US forces cracked down on offenders. But Saddam himself proved elusive and would not be captured for many months. Coalition soldiers would spend their time securing the occupation and searching for other high-value government officials that had escaped the invasion. But as the coalition searched for these officials, violence between Iraq's minority groups soon erupted and insurgents began to assemble. Nonetheless, on May 1st, 2003, off the coast of San Diego, President Bush made a dramatic appearance. Landing on the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln, the former Air National Guard aviator wore a flight suit for his televised address in front of a national audience. Standing in front of an enormous banner reading "Mission Accomplished," he announced the end of major combat operations in Iraq. At the time, the proclamation seemed reasonable. The Iraqi military was in shambles, and Saddam Hussein had been reduced from an autocrat to a fugitive. But despite all appearances, the troubles were just beginning. For the next 8 years, the coalition was engaged in a protracted counterinsurgency and suffered heavy casualties, while many thousands of civilians lost their lives. In 2003, the mission may have been accomplished, and the brief conventional phase of fighting was indeed finished, but much like in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq had only just begun. The pointman steadies himself against the doorframe. The sounds of artillery and gunfire are everywhere, drowning out his thoughts. A tap on his shoulder sends adrenaline coursing through his veins. It's time to breach. Inside the concrete house, an insurgent keeps to the shadows. Twice in his lifetime, the Americans have come to his country, and twice his people have had to endure bitter defeat. This time will be different. He pulls a grenade from his belt. The pointman racks his shotgun. The insurgent pulls his pin. The Marine takes a breath. The insurgent touches a photo. Both men pray before the door is blasted open. Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. The Second Battle of Fallujah in November 2004 is one of the most notorious of the war in Iraq. It was a bloody slog of urban warfare, during which US, British, and Iraqi forces attempted to drive out Islamist insurgents under the leadership of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, a Jordanian jihadist known for masterminding a series of terrorist attacks. Fallujah marked a turning point in the war. It was the first major battle to be fought entirely against insurgents rather than loyalists of Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party. Although ultimately a victory for the US and its allies, this Pyrrhic triumph came at the cost of many civilian lives and failed to break the back of the insurgency, which would continue to thrive in the region. In today's episode, we'll examine how this brutal house-by-house battle unfolded and how it set the stage for a conflict that raged on for years to come. US forces had tried to take control of Fallujah once before, in April of 2004, following the murder of 4 American private military contractors. That operation, known as Vigilant Resolve, ended with a US withdrawal and an agreement that the local population would keep the insurgency out of the city. But instead, Fallujah would become a significant stronghold for insurgents such as Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Army in Iraq, among others. As the number of insurgents swelled, American concern grew to match, and by September, US commanders were planning a military operation to seize control of the city, Operation Phantom Fury. The primary motivation was to provide security for Iraq's first elections of the post-Saddam era. But another important strategic objective was the capture of Zarqawi, who was believed by the US to be holed up in Fallujah. US forces had kept a tight hold on Fallujah's surroundings. They maintained checkpoints on all roads leading out of the city and seized any Iraqi police and National Guard vehicles attempting to leave. During the night, AC-130 gunships destroyed every vehicle spotted with a weapon and conducted frequent bombardments of any house suspected to be harboring insurgents. The civilian population, recognizing the costly signs of an imminent American assault, fled the city in droves. Many neighborhoods were totally abandoned, including Fallujah's southern district dubbed Queens by US soldiers. By October, reconnaissance flights showed empty clotheslines and abandoned streets. Indeed, the civilian population was estimated to have fallen from around 280,000 to as little as 30,000. These empty neighborhoods were swiftly filled by more than 3,000 insurgents who took to operating in small groups of between 4 and 20 fighters amid the abandoned homes. These dispersed groups were able to weather the American bombardment in Fallujah's resilient cement houses. Unable to blast them from their shelters, the Americans would have to clear them out room by room. It would be a hard fight to even get to that point. Since April, the insurgents' numbers had doubled as they drew in combatants from virtually every armed group in Iraq. Trenches were dug, roads blocked with concrete barriers or collections of cars and trucks, jury-rigged emplacements of earthworks and sandbags prepared. The insurgents had even managed to capture some weaponry from coalition forces. Among the most effective defenses, however, were the improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, with which the insurgents riddled the city. Fallujah was covered in booby traps buried under the streets, taped to the side of telephone poles, and hidden in rubble, abandoned vehicles, or empty houses, ready to explode the moment a Marine passed by. Marine Expeditionary Force planners knew they would be walking into an enormous urban death trap, but the Americans had their own advantages. Most notably, their large force of professional and experienced soldiers. For Operation Phantom Fury, Commanding Officer Major General Richard Natonski believed it important to attack Fallujah with as much strength as possible. His forces, reinforced by 2 U.S. armored battalions and a U.S. Army armored brigade, consisted of 10,500 Marines who would be fighting alongside 2,000 troops from the recently established Iraqi security forces and 850 soldiers from the famous Scottish Black Watch Battalion from the British Armed Forces. This coalition vastly outnumbered the insurgents. The Americans also had the advantage of formidable air power, with AC-130 gunships on hand to provide close air support during the fighting. However, these aircraft would only operate at night for fear of being targeted by surface-to-air missiles. This caused serious consternation among commanders on the ground, with one officer remarking they would be fighting with one hand tied behind our backs. Nevertheless, their presence was a major boon to the US during the brutal urban warfare that was to come. Understanding the scale of the challenge ahead of them, American planners worked to ensure there would be no logistical disruptions during the battle, fearing possible attacks on convoys along the highway that could delay shipments and cause shortages. A vast excess of fuel, ammunition, and supplies would be sent to the forces around Fallujah to prevent any need for risky resupply. Major General Natonski divided the city into 2 halves and assigned to each a regimental combat team made up of mostly US Marines and reinforced by an Army armored battalion. These were RCT-1 and RCT-7, built around the 1st and 7th Marine Regiments, respectively. Each was hidden behind a large railway berm to the north of the city, which they would have to break through to begin the assault. RCT-1 would provide the main thrust of the attack, entering the city from the north, which was less heavily defended than the city's southern and eastern entrances. In order to lend an element of surprise to the attack, some elements of RCT-1 would launch diversionary attacks in the south. Meanwhile, RCT-7 would advance from the northeast to support the main assault. Its primary objectives were to ensure the Jolan district, where the insurgent forces were thought to be the most concentrated, and seize control of the Makadi Mosque, which housed the enemy headquarters. Heavy army task forces would lead the way on both thrusts, driving as rapidly as possible toward the city center, while the Marines took on the difficult task of house-to-house clearing in their wake. Meanwhile, the Black Watch would maintain the perimeter around Fallujah and prevent other insurgent forces from cutting the city off. Finally, 3 battalions of relatively well-trained but poorly equipped Iraqi security forces were brought in to support the Americans and provide peacekeeping after the battle. The battle began in the ER. On the night of November 7th, the Iraqi 36th Commando Battalion and their U.S. Army Special Forces advisors captured Fallujah General Hospital and several minor targets in the west and the south, seeking to distract and confuse enemy combatants. They were watched closely by Marines 10 miles away through the infrared camera of a Pioneer unmanned aerial vehicle, who relayed their observations to the forces on the ground via radio. 2 other UAVs were surveying the city that night, seeking out the dark outlines of insurgents clustering in place or manning a heavy weapon. These positions would be relayed to Basher, the codename given to the AC-130 gunships waiting to unleash their deadly payload of 105mm artillery shells. These attacks meant certain doom for their targets. The only escape was to take shelter in a mosque. Targeting a religious building is a war crime, making mosques guaranteed protection from aerial bombardment. Fallujah, known as the City of Mosques, had 200 of these to choose from. Mosques were also reported to house significant amounts of armaments, making them extremely useful locations for insurgent forces. The diversion was successful, securing the peninsula west of the city and the 2 bridges across the Euphrates River, allowing the regimental combat teams to prepare for the main assault to begin the following day. The daylight hours were spent striking key targets with artillery, unmanned predator drones, and guided bomb units to soften up the city's defenses. After dark, the Marines began their attack along the northern edge of the city, with support from tanks and artillery. They first captured the railway station before advancing into the city proper, entering the Haynab al-Dabat and al-Naziza districts by the afternoon of the 8th. The night was cold, with intermittent rain showers, but the Marines' path was regularly lit by the detonation of dozens of rockets and mortars from the insurgents, as well as tank artillery, mortar, and aircraft fire from the Americans themselves. However, some units struggled to break through the railway berm and were stuck for hours as engineers attempted to blast through amid withering fire and rain. The coalition forces made significant progress during the night, but when sun rose on November 9th, the momentum of the battle shifted. The insurgents began to aim their mortars more precisely and effectively, and their fighters took full advantage of the dense urban landscape to whittle down their foes. Small groups of insurgents would dash through the narrow alleys, emerging briefly to fire RPG rounds at their enemies before darting away out of sight, while others used the sturdy cement buildings as pillboxes from which to fire upon the approaching Marines. The fighting was at its most brutal inside the houses. As they advanced, squads of Marines would search each home one by one, clearing them of enemy fighters in slow, exhausting urban fighting. They found no combatants in most, but sometimes, without warning, they would enter a house to see grenades rolling across the floor toward them and a hail of gunfire bursting out of the shadows. Clearing a house required incredible persistence and overwhelming firepower, including the use of Mk-153 rocket launchers. If even these big guns failed, the Marines would resort to smashing the windows, tossing in grenades, and sending hundreds of rifle rounds into the house before bursting in to mop up any remaining foes. But this would be easier said than done. With insurgents lurking in every shadow and booby traps exploding around them, the Marines advanced through the streets of Fallujah at a snail's pace. Both sides would receive scant rest. Each night, with mortar fire continuing to rain down around them, Americans did their best to hunker down inside houses and sleep. In a bid to unsettle them, the insurgents adopted unique psychological warfare tactics, blasting incessant chants from loudspeakers in the city's mosques. In return, US Army Humvees roamed the streets playing everything from Guns N' Roses songs to the Predator sound effect in deafening volumes. The next morning, the urban warfare resumed in much the same way, with brutal fighting for each and every city block. The insurgents were relentless, but by November 11th, the northern half of Fallujah had fallen to the Americans. A day later, as US forces closed in on the insurgent headquarters, American aggression increased. It was estimated 1 in every 20 houses contained hostile troops, compared to 1 in every 50 houses previously thought. Now anticipating enemy fire from every building, the Marines' standing orders became "Enter every room with a boom." As the units advanced, insurgents who had slipped back behind the front line or had remained hidden emerged to trouble the rear of the advancing line. Marines had to remain behind to continually clear and re-clear houses. We spoke to a veteran of the battle who recalls, We were afraid of doors rigged to explode, since we had to go door to door and clear the buildings, and they didn't care whose house they rigged. We had guys attempt to breach doors of regular civilian homes, and as a result of the door being rigged, it would send shrapnel and debris everywhere. Nevertheless, at the end of the 12th, RCTs 1 and 7 had reached all of their major objectives, but it would take more time for the Marines to fully secure them. Often, the Americans would encounter not enemy fighters, but civilians who had failed to escape ahead of the battle. Although they would typically wave white flags in warning as soon as they heard the Marines approach, sometimes things did not go smoothly. Hundreds of civilians were killed over the course of this bloody house-by-house warfare. At some stage of the fighting, American artillery units began to employ white phosphorus, an extremely deadly incendiary agent, to root out dug-in insurgent forces. The use of this toxic, caustic chemical weapon is considered legitimate if used to illuminate a battlefield or to produce smoke, but its use against enemy personnel is a violation of international law and is a war crime. Some journalists accused the Americans of deploying white phosphorus against civilian targets, an accusation vigorously denied by the US military. It has, however, been admitted to using the weapon against enemy combatants when conventional weapons became ineffective, claiming to have ensured no civilians were present before using it. By December 13th, the fighting had begun to slow. Fallujah was under almost total coalition control, although the occupying forces still faced stiff resistance from isolated pockets of insurgents. Some of the fiercest individual fights came in the battle's closing stages, such as the so-called House of Hell, in which a Marine battalion faced down a group of well-trained, fanatical Chechen fighters in a well-defended home. Around this time, humanitarian operations were allowed to begin, despite continued bouts of airstrikes and small arms fire. RCT-7 set up a humanitarian center at the Al-Hadra Mosque, and Marines in the Jolan district arranged for local Iraqis to enter the city to recover the bodies of dead insurgents. For the following 2 weeks, MEF Command described the ongoing operations as simply mopping up the final pockets of militants. Sporadic combat would continue until the 23rd, after nearly a month and a half of fighting. Since the battle, allegations of war crimes, massacres, and human rights abuses have emerged. This has made Fallujah a focal point for opposition to the war in Iraq and across the West. The battle was brutal, ultimately proving to be one of the bloodiest in the entire conflict. Coalition forces suffered 720 casualties, with 107 killed and 613 wounded. Of these, 95 of those killed and 500 of those wounded were American, while 4 British soldiers were killed guarding the highway. Deaths among the insurgents are estimated as ranging from 1,500 to 2,000 killed, and another 1,500 captured. Fallujah's civilians suffered 800 lives lost over the course of the battle. And in the years since, there's been a marked rise in infant mortality, cancer, and congenital anomalies, or birth defects, a consequence of depleted uranium exposure from munitions. The city, too, witnessed catastrophic destruction, with nearly 1/5 of its buildings destroyed and over half of those remaining experiencing heavy damage. Fallujah, once the city of mosques, had seen 60 of its 200 places of worship destroyed during the battle. Although the city was captured, the coalition had failed to land a decisive blow against the insurgents. Many of them simply slipped away into the surrounding Al-Anbar province, including Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. By 2006, the province, with the exception of the city of Fallujah, was reported to be in total insurgent control, leaving the United States with the hard task of battling them for many years to come. Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian, and in today's episode, we'll be taking our second look at the controversial subject of the 2003 Iraq War. This time, however, we will be covering the events from the Iraqi perspective by exploring how the Iraqi people reacted to the invasion and the subsequent occupation by Western powers. We'll also look at the rise of extremism and sectarianism that occurred after President Saddam Hussein's regime was toppled, and how all this set the stage for the many years of insurrections, civil war, and international intervention. It cannot be overemphasized how much of a shock the 2003 invasion was to the Iraqi people. Even when President George Bush gave Iraq his famous 48-hour ultimatum, Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein remained convinced that US forces lacked the capacity to wage more than a limited military campaign against his country. Saddam and his generals were well aware of past American failures, such as the infamous Black Hawk Down incident during the Somali Civil War. Saddam had also studied the conflict in Vietnam and hoped to replicate the success of the North Vietnamese by bogging down any invasion with defensive attritional warfare. With graphic scenes of destruction plastered across American TV screens, Saddam expected popular opinion to quickly turn against the conflict until coalition forces withdrew in disgrace. Yet, as we will see, many factors conspired to doom the Iraqi war effort long before the first shots were fired. Chief amongst these factors were Saddam's legendary paranoia, which made men like Joseph Stalin seem completely sane by comparison. His direct preparations for the war were greatly surpassed by his efforts to completely lock down the Iraqi populace, pouring huge resources into the state security apparatus and surveillance programs. Many of the intelligence organizations that Saddam created were in fact tasked primarily with spying on each other. Being late to the blame game was fatal, and so these various agencies spent months merrily chasing phantoms and inventing elaborate conspiracy theories. Naturally, the sentence for being accused in this web of lies and intrigue was always the same: death. Predictably, this insanity had a profound effect on the military readiness of the country. Saddam valued loyalty above all other traits and divided his forces into three groups based on their perceived trustworthiness. These were the regular army, the Republican Guard, and finally the Special Republican Guard, or SRG. Visits between officers of different army groups were forbidden, and joint operations were unthinkable. One SRG commander recalled after the war, "We never coordinated with the Republican Guard. I had no relation with any other units or fighting forces. No other units were ever allowed near our unit. No visits between other officers ever allowed." In Saddam's mind, the only possible reason two officers of differing units would ever want to talk to each other would be to discuss a coup. Yet, despite their highly dysfunctional leadership, the average Iraqi soldier strode into battle with a surprising degree of misplaced confidence. For years, the army was blasted with religious rhetoric, promising that the infidel Americans would soon fall before the sword of Islam. The prevailing attitude among the military was that the US was a paper tiger, able to emit a terrifying roar, but incapable of enduring any serious losses. Since his successful coup in the late 1960s, Saddam Hussein had ruled Iraq at the head of the Arab Socialist Ba'athist Party, which functioned as the central government and controlled all aspects of state policy. Given his unusually long reign, an entire generation of Iraqis had grown up having experienced nothing but Saddam's dictatorship. So few could imagine a world without their tyrannical leader exercising absolute power over their daily lives. However, despite Saddam's oppression, it is surprising how outright hostile the average Iraqi citizen was towards their supposed American liberators. For 12 years, America was only ever known as the distant oppressor, raining terror from the skies via airstrikes and subverting Iraqi culture by funding insurrectionist movements. Meanwhile, the few natives who benefited from Western education experienced decades of villainization and dehumanization at the hands of the Ba'athist Party, who painted them as traitors who sold out their own country for American petrodollars. Many Iraqis were further distrustful of America after its behavior during the Iran-Iraq War, when it had cheered Saddam on as an indispensable ally in the Middle East, only to turn on his regime as soon as he threatened American interests in Kuwait. Saddam's regime also possessed a natural air of legitimacy thanks to his close ties to Islam. This was due to his extensive program of mosque building throughout Iraq and decades spent manipulating his citizens into a state of unquestioning religious devotion. Even those Muslims that hated their dictator still viewed his regime as inherently preferable to a democratic state, especially one subject to degenerate Western influences. This was a concept that the US was simply unaccustomed to dealing with, and led to many problems further down the line. A second, and arguably far more important factor that the US failed to consider was the ideological divide between the two major branches of Islam, the Sunni and the Shia. The reigning Ba'athist party consisted primarily of Sunni Muslims, while the neighboring Iran had undergone a revolution in 1979 that resulted in the creation of a Shia-controlled Islamic Republic. Fearful of a similar revolution in Iraq, Saddam brutally oppressed his Shia subjects, excluding them from positions of authority and conducting mass executions whenever there was any hint of rebellion. But such tyrannical measures, while effective in the short term, served only to stoke the fires of sectarian violence that would blaze out of control almost from the moment that US forces stepped across the border. Much of the chaos following the invasion could have been avoided had the invading coalition forces drafted a feasible plan for bringing stability in the wake of a regime change. Sadly, this was not the case, and civil disorder quickly became the order of the day, with Shia militant groups seeking vengeance on their former Sunni oppressors. Troubles peaked in the capital city of Baghdad, which fell into a state of virtual anarchy following its capture. Shopkeeper Mohammed Abbas, who had fled the city as the Americans approached, said, "When I got back to Baghdad, it was not the city I had left just a week before. You saw people walking everywhere carrying looted goods. Nowhere could you see any sign of law and order. No police, no military, no government, nothing. Everything had collapsed." The feelings of betrayal amongst the civilian population perhaps reached their peak after the Al-Tabul raid in early 2004, when US forces entered and ransacked a mosque whose imam had recently begun preaching anti-American rhetoric and providing bomb-making lessons to would-be insurgents. Although a large cache of weapons and explosives were uncovered during the raid, Muslims across Iraq were horrified by the images of the desecrated holy place, with furniture smashed and copies of the sacred Quran scattered across the floor. To add insult to injury, the Americans offered no apology, instead merely publishing a list of the seized items and brushing off the affair as just another routine operation against Saddam's forces. Extremist clerics were quick to jump at this golden opportunity, decrying the occupiers as devils, whose sole purpose was to wage a war against the faithful of Islam. To aid this narrative, terrorist and militia groups attacked coalition bases dressed as civilians, forcing American soldiers to treat everyone as a potential threat. This created a vicious cycle of mutual distrust, each act of bad faith on one side triggering retaliation by the other, which only led to further escalation. Given how volatile the situation was, coalition forces quickly announced a provisional government to provide a peaceful transition to democracy. But when the members of the new Iraqi governing council were revealed, the public was shocked to discover that it consisted of 13 Shias and only 10 Sunnis, 5 of whom were Kurdish minorities. To the Americans, this was simply a matter of proportional representation. After all, the Shias were the majority. However, to the Sunni loyalists of Iraq, the sight of the coalition raising up a government led by Shiites and Kurds was proof that Saddam's anti-Western rhetoric had been right all along. The situation was not helped by the behavior of some opportunistic Shia who quickly stepped in to fill the void left by their Sunni counterparts. To quote Sunni government employee Abu Mustafa, "All of these senior officials had simply vanished, and soon we began to see a new sectarian order. People claiming to be doing the bidding of the Shiite religious authorities began to fill the posts left open by the vanished Baathists. They began verbally abusing and firing Sunnis or anyone they distrusted." Fortunately for America, there was still one organization that had a solid plan for dealing with the rising tensions in Iraq: the CIA. In the aftermath of the invasion, the CIA was in charge of tracking down and capturing as many members of the former Iraqi intelligence agencies as possible. Their efforts eventually succeeded when they rounded up a huge cabal of Ba'ath Party loyalists, many of whom openly admitted to torture, murder, and various criminal activities. Having listened carefully to the various testimonies made against these men, the CIA quickly concluded that there was only one reasonable course of action: to immediately offer them their jobs back and rebuild the core of Saddam's police state from the ground up. The CIA rationalized this decision with the logic that under Saddam, terrorist activity in the region had been kept to a minimum, and therefore there was nothing intrinsically wrong with his methods, only his goals. With all the worst aspects of the old regime now being restored by the very people claiming to be their liberators, the Iraqi people were finally pushed over the edge. An explosion of violence rocked the nation, and the capital city was divided up into warring Sunni and Shia suburbs. The occupiers could do little but watch as chaos engulfed the nation, their efforts to help constantly roadblocked by radicalism of their own inability to understand Iraqi culture. This bitterness and mistrust created an atmosphere where coalition soldiers saw danger around every corner. The political vacuum left by Saddam's defeat also allowed many extremist organizations to gain a significant foothold in the Middle East, turning the country into a war zone between government forces and radical militias. By 2006, the violence had escalated into a full-scale civil war that saw the attempts of ethnic cleansing by both Sunnis and Shias, resulting in the displacement of several million people. To this day, Iraq remains one of the most unstable countries on Earth, with American forces being withdrawn in 2011, only to return in 2014 to combat the growing power of ISIS in the region. Faced with endless threats, both external and internal, the fragile democratic state, now ruling the nation, is constantly hamstrung by the meddling of foreign intelligence agencies and the deep, bitter divisions amongst its populace. But with ISIS finally losing its territory in the country in 2017, some still cling to the faint hope that Iraq may finally be regaining its footing as a modern nation. Even so, there is still much work left to be done. Following the events of September 11th, the United States led a successful invasion of Afghanistan, crippling Al-Qaeda and ousting the Taliban from power. However, neither the Taliban or Al-Qaeda had been eliminated completely. With both Mullah Omar and bin Laden escaping capture, the Americans were now left with the unenviable task of nation building in a country ravaged by decades of war. I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian, and today we will be looking at the American occupation of Afghanistan. The Taliban's fall was swift and brutal. Their fighting capability was obliterated by the Americans in a lightning war that decimated over 20% of its total forces by the end of 2002, and thoroughly destroyed the emirate as a government entity. Despite this catastrophe, the Taliban were eager to get back on their feet, forming a number of committees in 2003 known as Shiras. These councils aimed to unite their scattered cadres still left fighting by re-establishing a formal chain of command, expanding recruitment, and strengthening logistics, a task made more difficult thanks to the new occupation of their country. For the United Nations, keeping stability in Afghanistan meant denying the Taliban any opportunity to exert their influence. It was an endeavor which required the assistance of all allied nations in the coalition. It was because of this that the UN established the International Security Assistance Force following the Bonn Agreement in 2001. With NATO assuming direct control in August 2003, the ISAF expanded gradually from its base in Kabul into the rest of the country. Provincial reconstruction teams were also created from multinational elements to aid in stabilization, development, and most importantly, extending the influence of Afghanistan's central government. However, the ISAF soon began to stumble, with several issues hindering their mission. Most critical of these was the lack of understanding when it came to ethnic, tribal, and political complexities. Cooperation with the post-Taliban political order was also difficult due to rampant nepotism and tribal patronage. In contrast, the Taliban set about remobilizing their forces. Taliban leaders traveled throughout their existing constituencies all across Afghanistan and neighboring Pakistan, inviting former members and others in their family to join the new insurgency. The prospect of nation building was not a welcome one for the Americans, nor was the idea of staying there as a counterinsurgency force. However, the military recognized a need to consolidate gains through building local support, as well as the necessity for counterterrorism. The mission was clear: neutralize all militants associated with al-Qaeda and find bin Laden. US and Allied special forces now turned to counter-terrorism operations, utilizing the same task forces involved in the initial invasion, while also establishing newer and more specialized groups to help find targets across Afghanistan and Pakistan. While effective, these operations did have their downside. US operators often mistakenly lumped Taliban leaders together with al-Qaeda despite any distinction or clear allegiances. By their own admission, Special Operations Forces at the time neglected careful intelligence. They were anxious to prosecute whatever leads came, no matter how questionable the source. Analysts who warned that intelligence might be faulty were often overruled. In the experience of one Special Forces team, they recall, "A lot of operations ended with us capturing low-level leaders or people who were associated with the Taliban. I don't think we ever caught anybody who was a confirmed al-Qaeda member. Rather, they were low-level Taliban operatives." Meanwhile, the ISAF was forced to contend with renewed offensives from the Taliban insurgency, who had grown more brazen thanks to the motivation of their new recruits and jihadist militants, spurred on by a fatwa issued by the Taliban in 2005 ordering the death of all infidels and others who supported the Afghan government. Between March and July, insurgents targeted Canadian ISAF soldiers throughout Kandahar and massed near Kandahar city for a major attack. British ASAF soldiers faced constant combat in northern Helmand province over the summer period. However, the Taliban were too self-assured and underestimated the ISAF, who fought back against many of these offensives and inflicted significant casualties. Despite ISAF's success, the increase of Taliban offensives raised issues of the coalition's lack of military footprint. By 2006, their expansion into the south of Afghanistan confirmed fears that their budgetary focus on reconstruction and development had allowed a full-blown insurgency to establish itself across sub-regions like Pashmul. In response, NATO launched the first conventional land battle in its history on September 1st, codenamed Operation Medusa, described by General David Julian Richards as a Second World War-style battle for Kandahar. The two-week operation saw Canadian, US, and Afghan combat forces assaulting Taliban defensive positions with the assistance of British, Danish, Dutch, and French combat support. The operation was tactically successful, with hundreds of insurgent casualties and no major Taliban operations that year. However, the coalition forces were hampered by national governments representing their forces, intervening on critical decisions and hindering necessary support, which revealed direct limitations on the coalition's efficiency. From 2006 to 2008, coalition forces in Afghanistan grew from 9,000 to 51,000 troops, with NATO using the success of operations like Medusa to adapt with the changing conflict. By 2008, the ISAF footprint encompassed the whole country, though a major shortfall in their operation was a continued national unwillingness to commit the full resources necessary for success. It was a concern that would continue to hamper the Americans even during their transition to the new Obama administration. President Barack Obama quickly soured on the Afghan mission, being especially wary of the costs and uncertainty involved. Initially, Obama opted to raise US troop levels in Afghanistan above the 100,000 mark for a limited period, though he made it clear that US force levels from that high point would only go down. Strategy also changed, as the increased use of remote drone missions took priority over the buildup of conventional land forces. Whereas the Bush administration authorized 52 drone strikes outside the war theater in an 8-year period, the Obama administration authorized more than 10 times that number, with 542 drone strikes killing almost 3,800 people from their kill or capture list. Suffice to say, the change in approach was controversial, with the use of signature strikes and other tactics garnering much criticism. Despite this, Obama was convinced it was the right approach, insisting, "This is a just war. Doing nothing is not an option." As the larger coalition built up in the region, resurgent Taliban attacks led to the ISAF launching a number of key operations, all involving NATO and Afghan security forces throughout 2010 onwards. The most prominent among these included Operation Moshtarik, a 15,000-strong force tasked with pacifying subregions of Helmand province. Operation Hamkari, aimed at securing Kandahar city and connecting its key districts, and the more famous Operation Neptune Spear, a controversial CIA-led mission to capture Osama bin Laden. This daring helicopter raid occurred on May 2, 2011, when US Navy SEALs entered bin Laden's Abbottabad compound in Pakistan, eliminating him almost as soon as they gained entry. Despite criticisms of Obama's policy up to this point, few Americans objected to bin Laden's death, which ended a decade-long manhunt following his escape from Tora Bora back in 2001. In July 2011, the president affirmed his withdrawal of troops, marking 2014 as the year of transition and 2016 as the deadline by which all US forces would be withdrawn. In 2015, just over 9,800 troops were present. Yet this introduced a problem, as the performance of Afghan security forces showed that they were not ready to pick up the slack from the departing US troops. As international forces left, the Taliban regained the initiative, having expanded dramatically since 2003 despite their setbacks. Military intelligence estimated the number of Taliban fighters inside Afghanistan to be around 30,000 insurgents throughout 2010 to 2012. By 2015, their manpower had reached over 200,000 men, just a year after the ISAF had been disbanded. When the Taliban seized the city of Kunduz in September, Obama was forced to scrap plans to withdraw all US troops by the end of his term. Meanwhile, the death of Mullah Omar back in 2013 also led to the rise of succeeding commanders like Akhtar Mohammad Mansour, who was able to consolidate power and take control of the Taliban, though his stint was brief, having been killed in a drone strike authorized by the president. This led to Hibtullah Akhundzada succeeding as the leader of the Taliban in May 2016, 1 month after the initiation of their own spring offensive, codenamed Operation Omari. Operation Omari involved capturing and holding major cities across Afghanistan. Despite successfully breaching the frontline defense of the Afghan National Security Forces and controlling a significant number of districts, their offensive was blunted thanks to US air power and special operation forces. Attempts to further seize strategic Afghan cities were thwarted by the combined US and Afghan security forces, resulting in high Taliban casualties. Although Operation Omari revealed severe weaknesses in the Afghan armed forces, they did not bring the Taliban any closer to winning the war. American counterattacks and support prevented the Taliban from achieving their objectives and highlighted the limitations of their frontal assaults. By January 2017, the direction of US strategy in Afghanistan would once again change, as Donald Trump assumed presidency. Trump was profoundly skeptical of foreign interventions, though he was committed to decisive action against terrorism, having criticized Obama's methodical strategy to defeat the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. He vowed to crush terrorism while refocusing resources on the United States. In September, US Defense Secretary James Mattis acknowledged the challenges faced in Afghanistan, with the Taliban controlling 40% of the country and a third of its population. The Trump administration conducted a review and developed a strategy aiming to compel the Taliban to negotiate for peace. From early 2018 to 2020, a series of failed ceasefires and renewed fighting alternated behind official arrangements between the US, Afghan government, and Taliban forces to negotiate peace. In February 2020, a peace deal was signed in Qatar before a large audience of diplomats from across the world. The president was satisfied with the Taliban's commitment, though he wasn't around to see its completion following his defeat in the 2020 elections. With Joe Biden assuming presidency in January 2021, the national mood had soured on military intervention thanks to domestic issues such as the coronavirus pandemic and its subsequent economic downturn. On July 8, 2021, the president announced the full withdrawal of military forces from Afghanistan, intending to honor the US Taliban agreement set by his predecessor. Inadvertently, this commitment gave Taliban commanders an opportunity to seize on, culminating in a rapid strategy of coercion and persuasion, which saw many Afghan security forces surrendering to the Taliban as they advanced on the capital. With these surrender deals, the last remnants of the US-backed central government had effectively handed over entire provincial commands to their adversaries and put the militants back into power 2 decades after they were defeated by the United States and its allies. On August 14, 2021, the Taliban entered the capital of Kabul with barely a shot fired. A total of 122,000 people were evacuated from Afghanistan in one of the largest airlifts in history. US casualties in the war included 2,500 killed and over 20,000 wounded. Taliban casualties were greater, with roughly 100,000 killed and 150,000 wounded. Finally, the civilian toll was more than 120,000 killed and wounded, with many more becoming displaced as a result of the war. After almost 20 years of conflict, the Afghan war stands to be the longest and one of the most disastrous in American history. Don't forget to check out our website, armchairhistory.tv. We have a ton of exclusive content that we've made and that other creators have made, like our video on Israel's modern military or the Front's video on the No Gun Re-massacre. Thanks for your support.